In this video, we're going to start taking a look at the idea of probability. And we're going to start with the idea of empirical probability. And then the next video, we'll look at theoretical probability. So before we start talking about any of the differences between empirical and theoretical probability, let's start by defining what probability is. Probability is just basically determining how often a random event will occur. And we have to keep in mind that the event just doesn't occur one time or two times or even 30 times. We're talking about a sufficiently large number of times that it occurs. So maybe hundreds or thousands or even millions. Right? And so the probability of an event is really easy to compute. It's just the number of desired outcomes divided by the total number of outcomes. Right? Empirical probability is basically referring to the idea that we've gone out, we've collected samples, and we're going to test probabilities of that sample. All right, so it's actually pretty easy to do empirical probability because all we're going to do is just add and then divide. All right, so let's take a look at a few examples of empirical sorts of probabilities. So we took a study, and of course, if you do a study and you produce the results of that numerically, then you do have an empirical sort of probability type of problem. And we have second graders and fifth graders that ask, which do you prefer, chocolate or strawberry? And below is just going to be a table that summarizes the responses. All right, so 36 second graders preferred chocolate, 64 fifth graders preferred chocolate, 24 second graders preferred strawberry, and then 16 preferred strawberry in the fifth grade. And then if we added those numbers up across, we would get 60 and 40 and 140 if we were to add the columns, and the total was 140. So based on all of that, let's start to answer some of these questions. What is the probability that a randomly selected student in the study is a fifth grader? And we're going to round to the nearest percent. So we take a look at all the fifth graders, and we know that there's 64 and 16. So there's 80 of those. And that's the number of desired. The total number of outcomes is 140, right? And so the exact value is going to be 80 divided by 140. And then, of course, we can go ahead and put this into our calculator to be able to approximate it because it asked us to. So we set 80 over 140, and we end up with about 57%. All right, so we're just going to say approximately 57% since 0.57. What's the probability that a randomly selected student is a second grader that prefers strawberry? And again, we're going to round to the nearest percent if necessary. All right, so we're looking at second graders that prefer strawberry. Right? And so that's 24 out of a total of 140. And once again, what we'll do is we'll just put that into our calculator. And we end up with about 17%. Right? So just be careful as to what is asked in the problem. If they ask for you to enter it as a fraction, you'll put 24 out of 140. And generally in probability, you're not going to simplify the fraction, right? So don't simplify. The reason you don't simplify your fractions is because if you do, then you're not really, you're not telling the reader particularly how many total samples there were. So if you were to simplify 80 over 14 into 4/7, that means there's 4 out of 7 as opposed to 80 out of 140. And this just means there's a lot more samples than 4 out of 7. Now, the next ones are going to be sort of conditional sorts of probabilities because they say that if the student is in the second grade, okay, so right now, we're not even worried about the fifth graders. Okay, so let's just ignore that row because it says if the student is in the second grade, what is the probability that that student prefers strawberry? All right, so that's going to be 24 out of 60. All right. So we just have to be careful as to the wording of these probability problems. Notice in number 2, it didn't say that given that somebody's a second grader or given that they prefer chocolate, or there's not a condition. All right, okay. So for number 3, there was a condition. So we have 24 out of 60, and then we can again just throw that into our calculator, and that gives us 40% exactly. All right, and then finally, we're saying that, or for number 4, it's suggesting that if the student prefers chocolate, what is the probability that the student is in the 5th grade? And again, we're going to round into the nearest percent. All right. So first of all, we just prefer chocolate. So we're not even considering these students. Okay. So we can just get rid of that. So the total number is 100, but we're really looking at just the 5th graders. Okay. So what's the probability of students in 5th grade? So that's going to be 64 out of 100. And that's really easy. That's just 64%. All right. So a lot of these types of problems, they're really easy to compute. It's just making sure that you read the problem correctly and answer what's asked. In the next video, we're going to move on from empirical probability. We're going to define theoretical probability, and we're going to work problems related to theoretical probability.